In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the impact of domestic violence on children. This will be the first of two lectures that are going to focus specifically on how children are impacted by domestic violence. In this first lecture, we're going to briefly go over some of the history and some of the numbers to examine the number of children who are impacted by domestic violence. We're also then going to break down and sort of typologize, look at the types of exposure that researchers often study, and then also connect that to the variety of behavioral outcomes that we see in children when they've been exposed to domestic violence. The reading for this particular lecture is going to be chapter 14 of your book. Then in our upcoming lecture, we'll go a little bit deeper into looking at some of the theoretical connections and theoretical explanations as they pertain to children, and then wrap up with policy implications. But let's go ahead and get started with this lecture. So when we look at the history of research on domestic violence, as we have stated in prior lectures, the real sort of revolution, the real growth of research and really identifying domestic violence as a phenomenon unto itself and a unique phenomenon started in the 1970s. So we started to see the reporting and publishing of various case studies. So small sample sizes that sort of looked at specific families or small samples of children who had witnessed domestic violence and started to get an idea of what did their exposure look like? How did they sort of think about the domestic violence? How did it impact them personally? And then as we saw that grew into over the next couple decades, and by the 1990s, we started to see the emergence of the recognition of domestic violence being a significant social issue. We had talked about in previous lectures about the Violence Against Women Act signed by President Clinton in the 1990s, and we saw just an explosion of research from there on. And as of now, as we moved into 2020 and beyond, one of the things that we see is although there's more and more research looking at not just domestic violence, but specifically the impact on children, there are still a lot of holes that we need to fill, and there's still a lot of areas of research that we should be looking into. So with any discussion about something and a phenomenon as serious as domestic violence, we always want to ask, well, what is the severity of the problem? Now, as you can imagine, there's no way to have a perfect count of the amount of domestic violence that occurs in the United States or in any other country. And therefore, there's no way to have a perfect estimate of the number of children who are exposed to domestic violence either in the United States or beyond. But throughout various studies, we start to see numbers that are popping up that give us a pretty good estimate of the number of children that are being exposed to domestic violence. So we start off here, we say that approximately overall, and number fluctuates over time, but give or take, there are about 74 million children under the age of 18 currently living in the United States by most estimates. And then you see down there below that we've got three different sort of quotes or pieces taken from various sources of literature, trying to put an estimate on how many of these 74 million children are being exposed to domestic violence. So the first one, roughly 15.5 million children in the U.S. witness at least one incident of parental violence per year. Approximately 7 million adolescents reside in residences that are identified as violent. 3 to 10 million children in the nation witness spousal violence every year. Okay, so a couple of things I want to sort of point out as we go through. You'll notice how we operationalize or how we define exactly what we're measuring often will change the numbers. And as we look through each one of these quotes from research, we can see that what they're talking about, that whether it's exposure to one incident or residing in a residence that is known to be to harbor domestic violence, they change. So obviously the numbers are going to change. And another thing I'm going to stress as we go through this lecture is the idea that when we talk about exposure to domestic violence, and we'll typologize it in a couple slides, but we want to think about this isn't necessarily like specific, like, a parent or a grandparent engaging in sexual assault or child abuse specifically. This is more where the domestic violence sort of originated between the parents or between the two adults in the household, and then has sort of been exposed to the children. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. So when we take all this together and we kind of give it a general estimate, most estimates would say that somewhere between approximately 1 out of every 7 kid is exposed to domestic violence. And that's a lot, right? If you think about a classroom size or growing up in an elementary school, if 1 out of every 7 kids face some sort of exposure to domestic violence in their household, that's a pretty large number. Another thing that has popped up in the research, and then this slide as well as the next slide, I'm going to talk about 2 relevant issues that are going to come back to us. One of the things that I have stressed with all of our lectures, and I will continue to do it, is thinking about our need for understanding domestic violence, not just with one theory or one type of situation, but rather thinking about the interconnected parts. And we're going to see more of that in this one. But a couple of things that really seem to pop up when you thumb through the literature is the sort of the youth and the family size of individuals and families who are impacted by domestic violence. So we see with this first quote that families stricken with domestic violence have significantly more children, often under the age of 5. So a lot of research is showing us that domestic violence is occurring more often in households with multiple children, and especially young children. And you can imagine the issues that also brings into it. And then second, younger mothers are more likely to be vulnerable. So young mothers between the ages of 16 and 24 are particularly vulnerable. So what is this? When we take these 2 things together, what do they tell us? Well, they're telling us that families that have more kids, more mouths to feed, right? More responsibilities, and are a younger family. So not just that having young kids under the age of 5, but having young parents, oftentimes having young mothers. So you have added stress. You've got kids with more responsibilities needing more care. You have mothers who are not that old themselves and are just barely into adulthood, and they're raising these children. So when you combine sort of the youth factor and the family size, we start to see a hot button issue for the possibility of domestic violence. And then at the bottom of this slide, one of the things that I think is important for us to consider is, and keep this in mind, is the socioeconomic connection, right? Oftentimes families that are larger with more kids, that requires more financial support in order to take care of that family. And also when you have younger mothers, they more often than not have not had the opportunity to have a lot of financial security at that point in their life. So not only do you see youth, inexperience, large family sizes, but that also is then going to be connected to lower socioeconomic status. And all these things combined start to create sort of a dangerous opportunity for domestic violence. Now it's important for us to consider the types of exposure. It's one thing to say, that domestic violence occurs in a household and there's children in the household, so we would say they're exposed to it. But as researchers, we want to make sure that we sort of compartmentalize and differentiate between different types of exposure, because the different types of exposure tend to have different types of impacts or effects on the children. And so when researchers work to operationalize types of exposure, the 3 most common breakdowns that you'll see are hearing, witnessing, and experiencing domestic violence. So once again, keep in mind, this is from the eyes and ears and viewpoint of the child or the children who are in the household. So in some cases, the children are in a household where they hear evidence of domestic violence. So maybe mom and dad don't want to take out their arguments or fight with each other in front of the children, so they go into another room or they go into their bedroom and close the door. But that doesn't stop the children from being exposed, right? They can still hear mommy and daddy yelling at each other. They can still hear the sounds of raised voices or thrown glasses or physical fights. A second type of exposure is when they actually witness it. So this is with their eyes. So in the household, the child witnesses one or more acts of domestic violence. And you can start to imagine when you see it with your eyes, it has a different impact on you as a kid as opposed to simply hearing it. And I'm not saying there's one that's good or bad or more or less, but it has a different impact. And one of the things that I often think about when trying to grasp what goes through anybody's mind when they're exposed to something like this is trying to contrast hearing versus witnessing, seeing it with your eyes versus hearing it. And one of the things that I think of is we think about watching horror movies, right? If for any of you who like the horror movie genre, there's a different type of impact on sort of like the slasher films, the Friday the 13th and things of that nature, where there's just, you see the blood and the gore and the knives and all that sort of stuff. That hits you differently than those more psychological ones, where maybe you never see the villain, you just hear them. There's creaking sounds, there's little innuendos, the shadows are about, but you never actually witness it, you only hear it, right? And if you kind of put that into your mind, you can start to get an idea of how these can have, living in a household with this type of negative behavior going on, and there's going to be a different way that it hits you personally, whether you're just hearing it, whether you're just witnessing it. And obviously, more often than not, for many children, they're not isolated to only hearing or witnessing or experiencing, which I'll get to in a second. Usually it's a combination of two or more of these three. But it's still important for researchers to be able to sort of, when conducting research, whether it's surveys or interviews or other sort of methodological approaches, to differentiate between the types of exposure, so then we can therefore think about how that is linked to certain behavioral outcomes going forward. Now, the third type of exposure is experiencing. And experiencing, in some research, will go so far as to talk about specific child or sexual abuse that is targeted on the actual child themselves. But a lot of research also sort of treats those as like almost a different topic for another article. And when they're looking at exposure to domestic violence, the experiencing for some researchers is to think of it as sort of the child's getting in the way, right? So maybe the child may try to protect mommy when daddy is yelling or trying to hit her, and the child gets hit in the middle of it, right? Or tries to step in and actually feels the wrath of the abusive parent. Also experiencing, and we saw this with one of our documentaries that we watched, was the idea that when the child is almost used as a pawn, right? They're used to sort of pull emotions out of the victim. And the abuser will threaten to take the child or will withhold food or something like that from the child until the victim gives in. So this is where I think the simplest way to think about it is the child is not just a bystander who hears it or witnesses it, but now they're caught in the middle of this situation. And as you can see with here, the final thing I have is that research consistently shows us that when children are actually thrust into the middle of the violence and have that experience type of exposure, that tends to be the most highly associated with the strongest negative behavioral outcomes. So let's take a look at those outcomes. So as researchers, once again, we're always trying to operationalize, compartmentalize, like try to break down and identify various factors, right? We talked about this in a previous lecture when we talked about coercive control. One of the toughest things is we all kind of get the idea of that pattern of behavior and abuse and manipulation and that we saw with coercive control, but it's much harder to actually measure it in a concrete way. And that's the same thing we're trying to do with this. It's trying to measure the types of exposure and measure the behavioral outcomes so that we can really start to understand the impact that domestic violence has on children. So the general sort of starting point is this first quote or this first comment here, that exposure in any one of those three forms interferes with development, right? So it interferes with psychological development, social development, and behavioral development of children. And so we've seen this with some of our theories, and we'll continue to talk about this in our next lecture in more detail, and to think about like, well, how specifically are psychological maturation How is it impeded, or social maturation, or behavioral maturation? And what are the potential short and long-term consequences for children? And also, we want to think about, well, before we identify the specific behavioral outcomes that we see within children, is we want to figure out what are some of these other sort of mediating or moderating factors that might interact with the exposure. And research is consistently showing that two things really stand out. So it's the exposure in and of itself, but the gender of the child seems to play a big role in the specific type of behavioral response that the child will have. And socioeconomic status of the family and of the child is another one of the top things that really has a strong influence on sort of the direction of behavior that the child's going to go down. And we notice, at least to date, when we look at the research, although we might expect race or religion or culture to have a strong impact on how children respond, and yes, there are definitely research out there. We've talked about the role of culture and ethnicity, and more tightly knit communities often have sort of resilience factors and things of that nature. But even when we look at everything, the two that really stand out for each specific child are gender. Boys and girls respond differently. And then socioeconomic status. And that may make some sense because those who have financial resources may have the opportunity for more help or outside assistance. Those who are lacking are sort of to have that issue of isolation that we've talked about before. So now it's time to sort of categorize or compartmentalize the various types of behavioral outcomes or behavioral responses. So the research typically focuses on the 4 areas in red. And yes, as you will see, there is some amount of overlap across these different responses, but these are the way that they're usually sort of the typology. So we're going to talk a little bit about in the coming slides about internalizing responses and what exactly those internalizing responses are. Externalizing behavioral responses and some examples of those. The impact on academic performance. And you'll see that as we get to academic performance, you'll see that sometimes it's connected to either certain internalizing or externalizing behavioral responses. And then finally, post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma. And we've also seen this where the literature often has sort of tied similarities to victims of domestic violence and witnesses of domestic violence as having gone through other types of situations in life that lead to PTSD or similar types of trauma. And then at the bottom here, this is what I want to keep you in mind as we go through. Like, one of the things we're going to talk about clearly is what are the internalizing behaviors, what are the externalizing behaviors, etc. But now it's time for us to start thinking about, well, as advocates and people who want to work to reduce domestic violence and help the victims and help the other individuals, the children who are involved, we need to think about it as, what would we do? How can we, in our position in society, make decisions to help? Make decisions to step in, identify when there's a dangerous situation going on. So I encourage you to keep in mind, as we look at the responses over the next few slides, is first, what are the signs, right? One of the things we've stressed and will continue to talk about in this class is that domestic violence often takes place behind closed doors. In many, many situations, there is no outward sign or evidence to the larger world that domestic violence is going on in a particular home or household. And so as people in the field, and for those of us who are listening to this, who are going to be the future teachers, the future law enforcement personnel, the future advocates and attorneys and social workers and potentially even medical professionals, what is our role? And as we navigate society and go through life, what are the signs to look for in a child? Because many of us are going to be in different professions where we are going to come into contact with children, and maybe even it may just be in our own neighborhood, right, with our own neighbors. What are the signs that might tip us off that there is something going on in that child's household, and it's not just some behavioral issue with the child, but rather the root cause of that behavioral issue may tie back to domestic violence in the home. So thinking about the signs that you might look for. Also, and here's where we have to be very careful, is the responses and impact of those responses. So as we'll see, and I'm going to use academic performance as a good sort of example of even when people are well-meaning and trying to do the best for individuals, our responses sometimes can have positive effects, but also they can have negative effects because once again, we are all interconnected. And we'll even talk about something that I've sort of referred to as the ripple effect of domestic violence. And so how we help and who we help has a big impact. And then finally, as I just said the word impacts, we might as well tie into it. Who does it impact, right? Obviously, if a child is in a home or in a living situation where they are being exposed to domestic violence, we want to respond in a way that has a positive impact to help the child. But at the same point in time, we also have to be careful because of the interconnected nature. Will we have positive or negative impacts on the larger community? So these are just a couple things. So the signs, responses, impact, SRI, is something that I'm going to sort of encourage us to think about as we look at, in this lecture and future lectures, and we look at the individuals who are impacted by domestic violence. So the first of the major sort of category of behaviors that we see. So research over the last several decades, as I said, explosion since the 1990s of the amount of research that has started to really focus on not just domestic violence between the victim and the abuser, but also for those who are sort of, the outside impacted in a secondary manner, the children. And so a lot of the research that comes up identifies a large number of internalizing behaviors that occur in children who are exposed to domestic violence. Now, we're not going to go into in a lot of detail in this lecture, but you're welcome to sort out the research or reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction. And obviously, it depends upon the type of exposure, right? We talked about witnessing, hearing, and experiencing. So whether or not you're more likely to, a child's more likely to have some of these internalizing outcomes may also be connected to the type of exposure, right? So it starts to get a little bit more complex, but it's still not too hard for us to wrap our mind around. So what are some of the internalizing behaviors that are often displayed and seen in children who are exposed to domestic violence? So things like, so internalizing means it like the harm and the impact is sort of taken into like on yourself, right? So social isolation, right? The child tends to isolate themselves from social situations and other individuals. Fearfulness, right? So they're not lashing out at other people. They become the scared one. They're fearful of strangers and other situations and loud situations. Depression, right? They start to internalize the negative experiences at home upon themselves. Low self-esteem. Maybe within this low self-esteem, maybe they feel a sense of guilt or blame for what they're seeing in the household. Nervousness, which kind of ties into some of these things. The ability to have trouble concentrating, right? And you can imagine how that would then would also impact academic performance, and generalized anxiety. So with each one of these things, the key thing to note is the idea that these aren't responses where the child goes out into the world or exits their home and lashes out in anger at the other people. Rather, the punishment is almost inflicted upon themselves. They're almost self-punishing with some of these internalizing behaviors. In many ways, if you see a child, if you work in a field where you sense some of these signs of internalizing behaviors, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's domestic violence going on in their life, but we have to remember because there is such a strong tie between these behaviors and the presence of domestic violence, we always have to keep that open as a possibility. On the other side of the behavioral spectrum, we have externalizing behaviors. So if the internalizing behaviors from the previous slide was about the damage and the harm being sort of inflicted upon oneself, so the child almost bringing the pain and suffering and then bringing it into them. Externalizing behaviors are where they take their pain and suffering and then it's manifested in a way where they lash out to the larger society. So examples of externalizing behaviors are things such as anger, violence, aggression towards others, right? So unnecessary use of aggression or violence, being overly angry, and then obviously conduct disorders. So conduct disorders are, inability to follow rules or purposely or what appears to be purposely lashing out at teachers or church leaders or other respected adults in the community. So within these things, one of the things that research does show is we had mentioned the importance of gender. And although it's not 100% across the board, one of the things that research does show us is that girls tend to exhibit more of the internalizing behaviors more often than boys, and boys tend to exhibit these externalizing behaviors as a response to domestic violence. And once again, that is definitely not something that is all the time, but the general norm is that we tend to see the boys expressing externalizing behaviors and girls tend to express more of the internalizing behaviors. You can imagine one of the things that I mentioned was looking for signs, right? And I mentioned it a second ago and I'll mention it again, is the idea that if you're a teacher or if you're just, an adult in a neighborhood, these little things, when oftentimes being a parent myself and somebody who has worked with kids in a lot of athletic and academic settings over the years, you come across kids who seem to have low self-esteem or tend to be, purposely socially isolate themselves or seem to show signs of depression. And other kids tend to be, inability to follow rules and acting out with, being overly aggressive or violent. Now, does that mean that me as a coach of a youth soccer team that immediately I have to assume that that child is experiencing domestic violence in their home? No, it doesn't. But as with everything else we talked about in this class, there's something going on with that child. So whether you're a teacher, whether you're a medical professional, whether you work within our court system, if you come to find and experience these types of things, there's got to be a root cause for it. And so we always have to keep our spider sense open to the idea of what else could be going on in that household. And that's when we look for other clues and other indicators so that we can identify the root cause and then hopefully get the child and the family the help that they need. The third of the areas, and this is what we'll sort of wrap up with today, and we'll spend a couple slides talking about this because I want to use it to illustrate some of the things I've been talking about. The ripple effect, the connection of multiple theoretical factors, and how everything kind of works together. So one of the behavioral outcomes that research has identified is low academic performance. And you can imagine when you say, well, low academic performance, well, of course, I could see if a child is socially isolating, showing some of those internalizing behaviors, if they're having lack of ability to concentrate, if they're feeling low self-esteem, then yeah, they may not perform well in school, right? And if a child is exhibiting some of the externalizing behaviors where they're failing to follow rules, conduct disorder, or they're being overly disruptive or aggressive at school, that may also impact their academic performance, right? So everything is interconnected. But when we look at this, some of the breakdowns that when we talk about how children it's manifested in academic performance, we find that children who are exposed to domestic violence overall tend to perform worse on standardized testing. So hopefully your little spider sense or your ears tingled on that one, thinking like, great. I mean, I know the world is changing, but we still live in a time and a place where things like the SAT and things of that nature determine your future, right? And so you can see there is this ripple effect within the child itself. Exposure to domestic violence, it's not just let's get them out of that home or once they grow up and move out that we hope that they'll heal themselves. No, oftentimes it can set the stage and impact their life forever. So we tend to see lower scores on standardized testing, poor academic performance in general. But then these last two bullet points, and you'll see at the bottom here, I'm going to ask, why are the last two so important? This is really going to illustrate my sort of idea of what I've sort of coined from the literature, and it goes by multiple names, but I sort of think of it as like, ripples in a pond, right? You throw a rock in and it just sort of impacts with waves of water all the way out to the edge. All right, so let's take a look at these last two. So children exposed to domestic violence have higher levels of inappropriate behavior in school. Okay, right? Conduct disorders, acting out, aggression. We can see where that sort of tied into those externalizing behaviors. And children exposed to domestic violence adversely affect the learning opportunities for other children in the classroom, right? Especially if they're exhibiting those externalizing behaviors of hostility, aggression, talking out, failure to follow rules, it will impact everyone else. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind, and I think what these last two bullet points show us is that it's not just the impact on the family itself, right? Domestic violence can have an influence on their peers, their academic colleagues, people that they come into contact with. And so it's important for us as society not just to get a handle on domestic violence for the children and the victim and the abuser, but also for their friends and for the people they come into contact with, because we're all in this together. So let's take a closer look at why I stress the importance of these last two things. All right, so why are the last two so important? So the last two were the idea of, sort of getting the impact that a child who has been exposed to domestic violence and engages in different types of internalizing or externalizing behaviors will often impact how well they do in school, and that will impact how well their classmates do as well, because one student can disrupt an entire classroom. And that's sort of what I mention as sort of what I call the ripple effect of domestic violence. So if we understand that domestic violence doesn't just impact the family unit, it has ripple effects that can reach out and impact friends and academics or classmates and things of that nature, the choice of how we choose to help really matters, right? As a society, whether we are the teacher, the principal, whether we are a social worker, whether we are somebody working in the family court system, how we choose to help. Heck, if we're a policymaker, if we sit on the city council or the educational board, the choice of help really, really matters. And why? Well, because if we fail to address the domestic violence, which is the root cause of the child's problems in the first place, we're only going to make matters worse. And not just for the child, but we can potentially make matters worse for other children through unintended impacts on their lives as they go through the educational system. And a couple sort of terms that we're going to talk about on the next slide that sort of illustrate how the choice of quote unquote help can have both positive and negative impacts, not just on the primary child, but also on their friends and classmates, are things like mainstreaming, tracking, and zero tolerance policies. And some of these things you may have heard about. There have been sort of like popular terms going back to at least the 90s that we've seen in educational reform, right? We want education, we want students to get through, we want them to learn quickly, effectively, and that means making the environment the most comfortable as possible. Well, so we have things like mainstreaming, and mainstreaming in a nutshell is where the focus is on having students who have different disabilities, to have them within the larger group. So they are mainstream. They aren't in a different classroom down the hall. And we'll see the good and the bad of that. I mean, the spirit of it is great, right? Children who may have signs of anger control or hostility issues, or are showing high signs of inability to focus or depression or things of that nature, we feel that by having them around other children, they will become mainstreamed. And we'll see how the good and the bad of that. Tracking in itself doesn't mean necessarily following them. Well, I guess it kind of does. But tracking is more of like you get into a track, right? I know when I went to school, and I imagine for many of us listening to this right now, there was, depending upon your math level or depending upon your reading level or whatever it was, you were put into this track, right? Where you sort of followed with this group of students and you were the high readers, the low readers, or somewhere in between. We'll see how tracking may potentially have an impact on students. And then zero tolerance. And zero tolerance has been a push with the educational system, especially with Get Tough policies and Get Tough on crime and other things, which means that, if a student fails to follow rules one time, or if a student does something that is, out of line, that there is no tolerance. It's not, a warning. It is immediate suspension or expulsion. And we'll see how oftentimes many of the things, the manifestations of behavioral manifestations that come from being exposed to domestic violence are things that could get a child in trouble or make them appear to be in a point where they have these certain disabilities, or that they are a quote unquote troublemaker. But we have to make sure we understand the root cause, and that's why it's so important for educators and people in general to recognize some of the sources and hints and clues about domestic violence, and then choose where we target, who we target, and how we target with help becomes so important. Here are the three sort of examples of how different approaches in the educational system have potentially had negative impacts for a lot of children, and even for the children who are not being exposed to domestic violence. And then we'll briefly wrap up with some alternatives that, if we think about how we approach domestic violence, how we recognize the signs of it, where we target the services and the help, how that might be an alternative to benefit everyone. So let's start with mainstreaming. So education policies change the composition of school and classroom peer groups. For example, a common concern regarding the ongoing push to mainstream emotionally disturbed students in regular classroom settings is that doing so may actually undermine the performance of other students, right? So it's not always a perfect world. You say, like, okay, if a student's having emotional issues, then by having them around other students, that should help them out. But we have to be careful of, is there going to be a ripple effect on how the other students are impacted by that student who is facing certain emotional issues and may act out in ways that sort of ruin the overall quality of the academic environment. And then tracking, which is sort of the opposite track. So mainstreaming says, like, let's bring everyone together, and we hope that it helps for everyone, but you can see that there may be negative impacts for outside students. Tracking, the placement of students into classrooms based on the ability or academic performance may actually group disadvantaged children with the most disruptive students. So the tough thing here is some of these students who, if they're in a household where they're exposed to domestic violence and their behavioral manifestation is to engage in externalizing behaviors like acting out, conduct disorders, being loud and aggressive and violent. Well, if they're suffering at school because of those externalizing behaviors, and then they're tracked or placed into a group of students who have disadvantages, you're further hindering those students who have different disadvantages by introducing these disruptive students. And then finally, we look at zero tolerance policies, right? If the idea of suspending or expelling a child for one violation of the school code or something along those lines, what you're doing, well, you're putting the kid back out on the street. You're pulling them away from the eyes of their teachers and other people who may recognize that there's something larger going on in their life. And you're sending them possibly right back into the home where the domestic violence was taking place. And so these zero tolerance policies ignore the source of the problem and may actually exacerbate the domestic violence situation in the home for these individuals. So with each of these, and I'm not trying to, trust me, I'm not one to say, let's get rid of mainstreaming or tracking or zero tolerance, or I'm not fighting for or against them. No. All I'm saying is, when we look at this ripple effect, we have to, until we understand why a particular child is displaying certain types of disruptive behavior, whether it be internalizing or externalizing or a combination of both, just reading, starting with the child and then not digging deeper and looking at the potential root causes of those behavioral outcomes can actually continue to harm the child as well as harm or impact the academics of those around them. And so several researchers have started to focus on why this is so important for us to consider alternatives, especially in the realm of domestic violence. And the authors listed on the previous slide are two that have published quite extensively in this area. And two of their sort of takeaways that we will return to as we dig deeper into this, especially when we look at policy implications, is one is the argument of why it is so important that domestic violence gets reported. Because whether it is the victim reporting the domestic violence, whether it is a neighbor or a friend reporting the domestic violence, or a teacher reporting suspected domestic violence, it's not just designed to help the victim and the abuser and their immediate family members, but also, when we think about this educational example, it also can provide substantial benefits to external parties, right? The other kids who are in that school system. And if you think about the numbers that we started with in this lecture, where if roughly 1 out of every 7 kids are exposed to domestic violence, at least in some way, shape, or form, think about how many kids in any given school are living in a home where there's domestic violence going on. And if they take the pain and suffering that they've experienced at home, and then it manifests in certain internalizing or externalizing behaviors in the school system, you can understand how their classmates, their teachers, and everyone else is also being damaged and harmed by that domestic violence. It has tentacles that reach out in that sort of sense, right? And so this is why one of the things that we will talk about in more detail going forward is the push for mandatory reporting, right? Many people who are in different fields are mandatory reporters of domestic violence. If they see evidence or indications, they have to tell their boss or their superior. They have to report it. And yes, there's not everyone agrees with mandatory reporting or the training for the mandatory reporters themselves, but it is something that we can't avoid, and it's something that we need to be aware of and understand and make sure that people are comfortable with their role. I know for myself, I'm a mandatory reporter in certain instances, and it's important that I know what to look for, who to report it to. And like I said, it's not just to save or benefit the people who are immediately impacted, but there are these ripple effects, external parties who could benefit from that reporting. And then also, another thing that this research is showing more and more of is the idea that there's a compelling reason for policymakers to find ways to help troubled families, right? So if an elected official or some other policymaker is focusing on, let's make education better, by doing this, well, some of these individuals will say, well, that's why we have zero tolerance. We need to get the troublemakers out of the schools. You got to be careful there, because if you're not targeting the root cause, you're just perpetuating a cycle of domestic violence within those homes. We've already touched on the fact that oftentimes children who grow up being exposed to domestic violence are more likely to become abusers or victims themselves. So oftentimes it's not just saying, let's track certain children so that those who are performing well can be in the high track, those who aren't can stay in the low track, or have zero tolerance policies. Rather, if I'm a policymaker and I really want to improve the quality of education for everyone, then I need to find ways and support policies that really help us get to the root of the problem. And if there's a possibility of domestic violence in a home, then we need to find ways to identify it and then have it reported, and then have policies set up to help those troubled families. Because and I can share with you, if any of you are curious, just let me know. I can send you the article. But there's growing body of evidence that oftentimes if domestic violence is revealed and reported, then the issues that the child is having at school and the negative impact that that child is having on their classmates disappear, right? If they can identify and find help for that family, all of a sudden you're getting to the root of the cause. The child now may show fewer signs of emotional disturbance or distress. They can start to focus, get along with others, and handle the situation, and it benefits everyone. So I'm going to wrap up with that for this lecture, but I hope you're really starting to understand sort of the importance of seeing all this in a very sort of holistic, interconnected fashion. And that's one of the things we really need to keep out. Now, it makes it that much harder when we become the advocates who are fighting to protect the victims, protect the children, and get help for the abusers. It's harder when we have to understand all the ripple effects and all the different agencies and parts of society that are impacted, but it's also a necessary thing for us to help everyone involved. So I'll see you at the next lecture, and we'll dive into a little bit more about the theoretical connections faced by children and understanding their behavioral outcomes, as well as go a little bit deeper into talking about some examples of policy implications that have been used to address domestic violence. Take care.